I knew something had changed long before I said it out loud. Not because of one conversation, not because of some afternoon that split my life into before and after. It was quieter than that. The kind of change that gets into a person the way weather gets into a house. Through the gaps you didn't know you'd left open. And by the time you notice the cold, it's already the temperature of everything. I met you on a Tuesday, which is the kind of detail that only matters in hindsight. Nothing about that day announced itself. I had a headache from the fluorescent lights in the conference room, and you were late, and you apologized in a way that wasn't really an apology, more an acknowledgement that the world had briefly inconvenienced both of us, and you weren't going to pretend otherwise. I remember thinking you had an efficient face, like you didn't waste any of it on performance. I didn't think anything else. I want to be honest about that. There was no lightning, no held gaze across the room. Just a woman in a gray coat who sat down, said 3 sentences that actually meant something in a meeting where everyone else was saying 40 that meant nothing, and then left. It would be a better story if I could tell you I thought about you that night. I didn't. I thought about you 3 weeks later, when I was standing in my kitchen not thinking about anything in particular, and your sentence from that meeting arrived in my head, fully formed, the way a name surfaces when you've been trying not to remember it. That's when I understood something had already started without my permission. I want to explain what I mean by that, because I think people misuse the word connection. So often it's stopped meaning anything. They use it for chemistry, for attraction, for the easy electricity of a good first date. That's not what I'm describing. What happened between us didn't begin as a feeling. It began as an interruption, a small, persistent interruption in the ordinary traffic of my thoughts, where you kept appearing uninvited, not dramatically, just present. The way a word you've just learned suddenly seems to be everywhere. I saw you again at Priya's birthday, the one at the restaurant with the terrible acoustics, where everyone had to lean in to hear each other, and the leaning in created its own strange intimacy across a table of 12. You were seated 4 chairs down, which should have made conversation impossible, and somehow we ended up talking anyway, over and around everyone else, in the fragmented way you talk to someone at a loud party, half sentences, held up and finished later, jokes interrupted by the waiter and picked back up 20 minutes on as if no time had passed. I remember laughing at something you said about your sister's dog, and catching myself laughing harder than the joke deserved, and feeling briefly embarrassed, the way you do when you realize you've shown more of yourself than the moment called for. You caught the bus that night, the same one I usually drove past on my way home, and for no reason I could defend, I parked 2 blocks early and walked the rest of the way so I could pass the stop and see if you were still there. You weren't. I want to tell you how foolish that felt, standing on a corner at 11 at night for no reason I could have explained to another living person, and how I told myself I was just enjoying the walk, and how I didn't believe myself even a little. That's usually where these stories speed up. The next few months, though, moved slowly, and I think that mattered more than anything that came after. We didn't fall into each other. We circled. There were group dinners where I made sure I sat where I could see you without it looking intentional. There was a work project that put us in the same room twice a week for 6 weeks, ostensibly about supply chains, during which I learned that you take your coffee with too much milk and not enough conviction about it, that you doodle small, precise geometric shapes in the margins of your notes when you're thinking hard, that you have a laugh you try to suppress and a laugh you don't, and that the suppressed one is somehow the better sound, because you save it, because it costs you something to let it out. None of this was declared, none of it was named. We were, by any outside account, colleagues who got along. I don't think either of us would have admitted otherwise, not because we were lying, but because the truth hadn't caught up to language yet. That's the part I want to be honest about, because I think people romanticize the moment of realization and skip past the long, unglamorous middle where you already know something and still don't know it, both at once, for months. I remember the first time I understood how far it had already gone. It was raining, one of those late October rains that doesn't so much fall as hang in the air and get you wet through persistence rather than force. And I was walking to my car after work, and I saw you across the lot fumbling with an umbrella that had clearly given up on its purpose some time ago. I didn't think. I just walked over and held mine over both of us, badly, at an angle that meant my left shoulder took most of the rain, and we stood there for a second too long before either of us said anything. And you looked at me, really looked, the kind of look that isn't checking your face for a reaction, but reading it like a paragraph, and you said you didn't have to do that. And I said, I know. And that was the whole conversation. But something in the way you said it, and the way I answered, told both of us that we'd stop pretending, even if neither of us had said what we'd stop pretending about. I drove home soaked on one side and didn't turn the heat on for the first 10 minutes, because I wanted to sit with what had just happened before I let the car's ordinary comfort talk me out of it. I should say something here about who I was before you, because I don't think the rest of this makes sense otherwise. I was careful, not guarded in the dramatic way people mean when they say that. I wasn't nursing some great wound, wasn't performing wariness as a personality. I was simply a person who had learned, through several unremarkable disappointments, that most connections cost more than they return, and that the efficient thing to do was to keep most of yourself in reserve. I dated, I had friends I loved, I was not lonely, particularly, or at least I wouldn't have called it that. I had simply stopped expecting anyone to reach the parts of me I'd quietly filed under not necessary to share. I'd made my peace with that. I'd built a whole comfortable life around the architecture of enough. You didn't ask to be let past that. That's the thing I keep returning to do. When I try to understand how this happened, you never pushed. You never asked me the kind of leading questions people ask when they want access to you and don't want to admit it. You seem sad today, what are you really thinking? All the small invasive kindnesses that are actually just curiosity dressed as concern. You just kept showing up exactly as yourself, unhurried, and somehow that unhurried consistency did what none of the pushing ever could. I stopped needing to defend the door, because you never tried the handle. You just stood near it long enough that eventually I opened it myself. I think I fell for you, if that's even the right verb for something this slow, in a Waffle House at 1 in the morning. We'd gone to see a friend's band play a set that ran 40 minutes over and ended with a broken amp, and neither of us wanted the night to end yet, so we found the only place still serving food, one of those fluorescent rooms that exists outside of ordinary time, and we sat in a booth with cracked red vinyl and you told me about your father. Not the highlight reel version people give at dinner parties, the version with the good anecdotes and the tidy lesson at the end. The real one, the uneven one, with the parts that don't reflect well on anyone, including you. You told me about the year you didn't speak to him, and the specific humiliating way you'd finally called him. And you told it without flinching, without asking me to feel sorry for you, just laying it out like you trusted me to hold it without dropping it or making it about something else. I didn't say much back. I remember that. I mostly listened, which is not something I'm naturally good at. I tend to listen for the gap where I can say something clever, the way most people do, more interested in my own eventual contribution than in the thing being said to me. But that night I wasn't waiting for a gap. I was just there, in the story, the way you are when a book is good enough that you forget you're reading. And at some point, maybe 2 in the morning over cold hash browns, I understood that I had never told anyone the equivalent story about myself, and that I wanted to tell you mine. Right then badly, the way you want water after a long day in the heat, so I did. I told you about my mother's illness, the year I dropped out of school to be near her, and the anger I still carried about it that I'd never said out loud because it seemed monstrous to be angry at someone for dying. I'd never told anyone that part. Not my closest friends, not the one relationship that had lasted long enough to deserve it. I told you in a Waffle House at 2 in the morning, on our maybe fourth actual outing, and you didn't flinch either. You just nodded, like it made sense, like the anger wasn't monstrous at all, just human, and you said of course you were angry. She left, even though it wasn't her fault, that doesn't make the leaving smaller. And I sat there with my cold coffee and felt something in my chest give way that I hadn't realized was braced. That's the moment I'd point to, if I had to point to one. Not because it was romantic, it really wasn't. The lighting was terrible and I had ketchup on my sleeve, but because it was the first time I understood that being known by you wasn't going to cost me what I'd always assumed being known would cost. I'd spent years believing that if someone really saw the whole shape of me, they'd flinch, or worse, they'd try to sand down the parts that made them uncomfortable. You didn't do either, you just made room. And once I felt what that room felt like, I understood I wasn't going to be able to go back to living without it. I want to tell you about the months after that, because I think people skip this part too. The unglamorous stretch where two people who've had one enormous honest conversation don't know what to do with each other yet. We didn't become a couple that night. We didn't become anything, officially, for another 2 months, which in retrospect feels like an act of collective patience neither of us gets enough credit for. We kept having dinner. We kept finding reasons to text about nothing. You sent me a photo of a dog wearing a raincoat with no caption, and I understood it perfectly, the way you understand an old friend's shorthand. We went to a museum and disagreed, genuinely disagreed, about a painting, and I remember being surprised by how much I enjoyed being disagreed with by you, how it didn't feel like a threat, just two people turning the same object in different light. I noticed things about myself changing, before I noticed things about us changing. I started reading more because you read constantly and I wanted to have things to say to you about it. I started running again badly because you ran, and some competitive, hopeful part of me wanted to be able to keep pace with you eventually, literally and otherwise. I found myself gentler with my own family, patient in ways I hadn't been, as if some of your steadiness had rubbed off on me by proximity. None of that was your doing exactly. You never asked me to change. But being near you made we want to be a version of myself I could imagine you liking. And wanting that turned out to be its own kind of transformation. There was a night, I think this was December, because I remember the cold and the specific blue dark that only happens in December at 6 in the evening, when we were walking back from your apartment to the train, and you stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, not dramatically, just stopped and said, I don't know what this is, but I don't want it to stop. And I laughed not because it was funny, but because I'd been carrying the exact same sentence around in my chest for 3 weeks and hadn't found the courage to say it. And hearing you say it first felt like relief and vertigo at the same time. I said, me neither. And we stood there on a sidewalk in the cold, not touching, just looking at each other. Two adults who'd apparently decided that this particular truth deserved to be spoken outdoors, in public, without ceremony, because ceremony would have made it smaller. I think that's when it became real in the way that things become real when you say them. Not because they weren't real before, but because naming a thing changes your relationship to it. Before that sentence, I could have walked away and told myself it was nothing, a friendship with unusual depth, nothing more. After that sentence, walking away would have meant lying, and I have never been able to lie convincingly to myself, no matter how many times I've tried. We didn't rush what came next. I want to be clear about that, because I think there's a cultural instinct to speed up a story once the declaration happens, as if everything before the kiss is throat clearing and everything after is the point. It wasn't like that for us. The slowness that had defined the first several months didn't disappear once we admitted what we felt. It just changed shape. We were careful with each other, not out of fear, but out of a kind of respect, the sense that something this good deserved to be built rather than seized. The first time you stayed over, we didn't do anything you'd put in a story to make it interesting. We watched half a documentary about deep-sea creatures and fell asleep on my couch, and I woke up at 4 in the morning with your head on my shoulder and my arm asleep beneath you, and I didn't move, because moving would have meant choosing my own comfort over another 10 minutes of that particular ordinary miracle. Someone's weight against you, trusting enough to have gone unconscious there. I lay there until the sun came up, thinking about how strange it was that the moment I would remember most from those early months wasn't a kiss or a declaration, but my own dead arm and your breathing, slow and even, 3 inches from my collarbone. I think that's the difference between infatuation and whatever this was becoming. Infatuation wants the highlight reel. It wants the grand gesture, the cinematic weather, the perfectly lit conversation. What I felt for you wasn't interested in any of that. It wanted the unremarkable hours. It wanted grocery shopping and folding laundry in comfortable silence, and the particular boredom of a Sunday afternoon spent doing nothing together. Because that boredom shared turned out to be one of the best things I'd ever felt. I don't want to pretend it was easy after that, because it wasn't, and I think a story that skips the difficulty isn't really a love story, just an advertisement. There was a stretch in the spring, maybe 5 months in, when I got frightened. Not of you, of the size of what I felt. I remember lying awake calculating in the specific, humiliating way people do when they're trying to talk themselves out of something good, all the ways this could eventually go wrong. I thought about my parents' divorce, which I rarely think about, and about the particular numbness that followed it, and some old, cowardly part of me decided the safest thing to do was create distance before the distance could be created for me. I pulled back for about 3 weeks. I told myself I was busy, which wasn't entirely a lie, but wasn't the truth either. I answered your texts later than I usually did. I found reasons not to see you on weekends. I want to tell you I did this thoughtfully, but I didn't. I did it the way people do most self-protective things, half-consciously, telling myself a story about circumstances while quietly engineering the outcome. You noticed. Of course you noticed. You notice everything. That's one of the first things I loved about you, and also in that moment one of the most uncomfortable. You didn't confront me the way I half expected, with hurt or accusation. You just asked plainly over the phone, on a Tuesday that felt deliberately unremarkable. Did I do something? And when I said no, too quickly, you said okay. But something's different. You don't have to tell me what it is right now. I just want you to know I noticed, and I'm not going anywhere, whenever you're ready to say it. I sat with that for 2 days before I called you back. I told you the truth, that I was frightened, that I hadn't let myself feel this much for someone since my mother died, and some old stupid part of me equated loving something completely with eventually losing it completely, and that pulling away felt, in some backward way, like protecting myself from a grief I hadn't even earned yet. I expected you to find that exhausting. Instead, you just said that makes sense. I'm not going to pretend I can promise you nothing will ever hurt, but I can promise I'm not leaving because you're scared. Scared isn't the same as done. I don't think I'd ever been told that distinction before. Scared isn't the same as done, and it undid something in me that I'd been holding rigid for years. I came back from that 3 weeks changed, I think, more honest than I'd been with anyone, including myself, because you'd shown me that honesty wasn't going to be punished the way I'd quietly assumed it would. After that, things settled into something steadier, though steady isn't the same as static. We kept changing, kept surprising each other, which I've come to think is the actual definition of a relationship that's working, rather than one that's simply comfortable. You started leaving books on my nightstand with pages folded down, wordless recommendations, and I started doing the same for you, and our respective apartments slowly filled with each other's opinions, dog-eared and specific. I learned the particular quality of your silence when you were working through a hard idea, versus the silence when you were upset, and I learned not to fill either one, just to sit near it until you were ready. There's a memory from that summer I return to more than almost any other. We'd driven 4 hours to see your grandmother who was failing, and the visit had been hard in the quiet, exhausting way those visits are. Not dramatic, just heavy, full of the specific grief of watching someone forget the shape of their own life in real time. On the drive back, somewhere past midnight on a stretch of highway with almost no other cars, you started crying, the kind of crying that isn't loud, just steady. The tears of someone who's been holding a great deal for a long time and has finally run out of road to hold it on. I didn't say anything comforting, 'cause I didn't have anything comforting that wouldn't have felt cheap. I just reached over and took your hand off the wheel. You were driving. No, wait. I was driving, and you were in the passenger seat, and I took your hand and held it against my leg for the next 40 minutes, while you cried and then stopped crying and then fell asleep, still holding on, your head against the window, and I drove the rest of the way with one hand carefully, because letting go of yours felt like the wrong kind of risk to take that night. I remember thinking, somewhere around exit 40, in the specific clarity that comes at 2 in the morning on an empty highway, that I would drive through worse nights than this one for you, that whatever this was between us had stopped being a question I needed to keep asking, and had become instead simply a fact about my life. The way gravity is a fact, unremarkable and absolute. I think people assume love announces itself with intensity, fireworks, grand declarations, cinematic weather. I used to think that too. But the longer I've lived inside this particular love, the more I've come to believe the opposite. The real thing doesn't need volume. It moves into your ordinary hours and rearranges the furniture so quietly you don't notice until you try to remember the old floor plan and can't. It's not the loud moments that convinced me. It's the boring ones. The ordinary Tuesday grocery run. The argument about whose turn it was to call the plumber. Resolved not with drama but with a shrug and a kiss on the temple. The way you leave the porch light on for me even when you go to bed before I get home. None of that would make a good movie. All of it made me sure. I asked you to move in with me on an unremarkable evening, over dishes, no ring, no plan, no candlelight. I'd been thinking about it for weeks, and it simply arrived in my mouth the way true things sometimes do, before you finished rehearsing them. You had your hands in the sink and didn't even turn around right away, and for a second I thought I'd misjudged the moment badly. Then you turned off the water, dried your hands slowly, in a way that felt deliberate, like you were making me wait on purpose, and said, yes, obviously. What took you so long? And we stood in my kitchen, dishes half done, laughing at nothing in particular, and I thought, this is what I was so afraid of all those months ago, and it isn't frightening at all. It's just this, ordinary and enormous at once. I won't pretend the years since have been without difficulty, because that would be its own kind of lie, and I've promised myself in writing this, to tell the truth even where the truth is inconvenient. We've had the arguments every real couple has, about money, about families, about the small accumulated resentments that build in anyone who shares a life closely enough for long enough. There was a year, our third, that was genuinely hard, full of the kind of exhaustion that makes people wonder quietly in the dark whether they've made a mistake. We went to a counselor for 8 months. We said things to each other in that small beige office that we'd never said anywhere else. Some of them ugly, some of them true in the way that only ugly things sometimes are. But even in the hardest stretch, I never once doubted the foundation, only the weather on top of it. That distinction matters more than I can explain to someone who hasn't lived it. There's a kind of love that's built on excitement, and excitement is fragile. It can't survive an ordinary Tuesday, let alone a hard year. And then there's the kind we built, slowly, over Waffle House coffee and highway silence, and a kitchen sink on an unremarkable evening, which turned out to be built on something steady enough to survive being tested. I think that's the real difference between the connections that last and the ones that don't. It was never about how it started. It was about what it was made of. I think about the woman in the gray coat sometimes, the one who apologized for being late in a way that wasn't really an apology, who said 3 sentences that meant something in a room full of noise. I didn't know that day that I was looking at the rest of my life. I don't think anyone ever does, in the moment. That's the strange mercy of it. You're allowed to walk past the most important day of your life without recognizing it, and only later, much later, do you get to look back and see the exact shape of the thread, running all the way from that gray coat to this kitchen, this ordinary Tuesday, this life we built out of nothing more dramatic than choosing each other. Again quietly, every day since. There's a particular morning I want to end on. Not because it's the most dramatic memory I have of you, but because I think it's the truest. It was an ordinary Saturday early, the kind of early where the light comes in low and gold, and makes everything look like it's being seen for the first time. You were still asleep. I was up, making coffee badly, the way I always do, and I stood in the kitchen doorway for a minute just watching you. One arm thrown over your face, breathing slow, entirely unaware you were being looked at, entirely unguarded in a way you almost never let yourself be awake. I thought about all the people I could have been standing in that doorway for, all the versions of my life that didn't happen, all the mornings that could have belonged to someone else entirely, and I felt something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite disbelief but sat somewhere close to both. I didn't wake you. I just stood there a while longer, coffee going cold in my hands, thinking that if this was what the rest of my life was going to look like, this exact, unremarkable, gold-lit ordinariness, this person breathing slow in my bed on a Saturday morning, then I had gotten, against every quiet fear I used to carry, exactly what I didn't know I was allowed to want. I still think that, most mornings. Not with the intensity of a new thing, but with the settled certainty of an old one, which I've come to believe is the better kind of love to have. The new kind burns bright and asks nothing of you but attention. The old kind asks for everything and gives back more than it takes, quietly, morning after morning, in coffee made badly, and a hand held on an empty highway, and a yes said over dishes in a kitchen that stopped, somewhere along the way, being just mine, and became instead simply ours. That's the story, as best as I know how to tell it. Not a lightning strike, a slow accumulation of Tuesdays, none of them dramatic on their own, all of them adding up to the only life I can now imagine having lived. I didn't choose you all at once. I chose you in small increments, over years, in kitchens and hallways and highways at midnight, until the choosing stopped being a decision at all and became, simply, the shape of who I am. I used to think love that arrived quietly couldn't be trusted, that anything worth having would announce itself the way the movies said it should. I don't believe that anymore. I think the quiet ones are the ones that last, because they were never built on the noise in the first place. They were built on something steadier, recognition, patience, the slow accumulation of proof morning after ordinary morning, that this finally is the one thing I never have to brace myself against. You are, I think, the only thing I've ever stopped bracing for, and I didn't know, until you, how much of my life I'd spent braced.